And today we're going to talk about three types of theory: um, tribalism, Marxism, and constructivism. But first, let's briefly review where we've come in our previous discussions of realism and liberalism. We said a theory is based upon a certain set of underlying assumptions about the world that try to simplify and abstract from reality. And so we can compare by looking at those assumptions for each of our theories. With realism, recall that we said that states are the main actors and that their motivations are basically security in the case of defensive realism or power in the case of offensive realism. In any case, they states pursue relative gains, meaning that they care where they are on the hierarchy, the ranking of great powers, and they try to rise up that hierarchy, ideally toward the top. They exist within the context of an anarchic international system, which just means that there's no central authority, no world government to make and impose laws or keep order. Therefore, it's a self-help system in the sense that each state has to provide for its own security, usually by arming. States carry out threat assessments constantly to try to, because they're worried about survival. And in order to make threat assessments, they focus on capabilities rather than intentions. The reason is that intentions change and intentions can be hidden. Countries blatantly lie about their intentions. So, what you do instead is try to look at other countries' capabilities, mainly their military forces, but also their size of their economy, their population, their technology, and then, of course, their geographic placement relative to you. So you look at their capabilities to see, can this other country threaten me, or is it too weak to really pose a threat? And then, what are the main predictions of realism? Well, realism basically sees world politics as a continuing struggle for power. Um, and that gives rise to intense security dilemmas where one country's efforts to make itself more secure make others less secure and set in place cycles of hostility, spirals of arms racing, and that sort of thing. The realism predicts that war and international conflict are regular and ongoing features of the international system, but that they intensify during periods of multipolarity or during periods of power transition. And then finally, realists are pessimistic about the real possibilities for genuine international cooperation and peace. What about liberalism? Again, we've to review. States are the most important actors, but liberals also make room for non-state actors, international organizations, NGOs, multinational corporations. The motivations of states are security, but also wealth. They have a broader view of state motivation, and in fact, states um, generally have they pursue absolute gains, meaning that instead of just paying attention to their ranking vis-a-vis other states, they're concerned about their welfare of their citizens and whether they're getting better off or worse off. And often the simplest measure of that would be gross domestic product or national income. The structure of the international system is anarchic, but it is modified by interdependence, where countries rely upon one another in terms of trade and investment and flow of information, ideas, people, and that knits countries together and provides a set of common interests or mutual interests that limit conflict. Moreover, unlike realists, liberals think that what happens within countries matters for international politics. The kind of country, the kind of government, for instance, whether it's a democracy or an autocracy, matters to the country's foreign policies and to which other countries it will be aligned with. Um, Generally, liberals believe that the offense-defense balance favors the defense, whereas realists believe that it favors the offense. Um, in a defense-dominant world, then states can feel um, less worried about their survival and can engage in more cooperation. The security dilemma is less intense, and therefore it's a more peaceful world. Threat assessments are not just capabilities. You have to look at other countries' intentions, and that's not just a passing, word or two. It has to do with whether the other country has a social order or um, a political order that is compatible with your own. Do they share the same values, the same um, outlook on right and wrong? So, what are the main predictions of liberalism? That defense dominance lessens security dilemmas and allows for cooperation, economic interdependence, and the shift of economies from land-based to industrial to information-based economies tend to lead to greater peace and the decline of warfare. The opportunities for mutual gain through cooperation um, stimulate institutions, international institution building, and finally, the spread of democracy supports democratic peace. Well, let's now turn to the remaining three theories we want to at least touch on, and we'll begin with tribalism, discussed in Amy Chu's article. And tribalist theory basically says that the main actors are groups of individuals who are bound by a common ethno-nationalist identity, a sense of being, we're all German, we're all Japanese, we're all Chinese, or we're all Palestinian, or we're all Israeli. We have a commonality by virtue of our national identity, which may be based upon history, language, culture, geography, a variety of different factors that tie a given people together and make them feel that they belong to one another. Their motivations are to defend the group against outsiders, so that a tribalist theory predicts conflict among different ethno-nationalist groups, especially when they are mixed within the same territory and therefore are struggling for political power. Ethno-nationalist groups, they want control of a state. They want a state that will represent their group, and ideally it would be exclusive to their group. This is a notion of self-determination, and sometimes ethno-nationalist groups feel the need to change state boundaries, either to exclude groups that don't belong in their view and within their country or state, but also to take territory that may belong to another state at a given time, but which a group believes they have brethren across the border who should join their own state. A good example would be the Kurds. The Kurdish people definitely have a national identity, a sense of commonality, but they're spread across 5 different countries, and some Kurds aspire to having a Kurdistan someday, a state that is carved out of the existing territories of other countries and becomes a state of its own. That would be a good example of a ethno-nationalist group. Now, by the way, this theory is based upon a basic psychological insight that is well established, and that is that humans, as a matter of evolutionary instinct and our desire to survive, tend to form into in groups and out groups. And so in groups are those that usually they start with kin groups, family, but they can expand from there to broaden nationalist groups are just one kind of in group, and it's a relatively recent and broad type of in group, only developing really since the French Revolution, the sense of nationhood. Um, but the in groups basically turn to see one another um, as mutually supportive of one another's survival, whereas out groups are seen as competitors and threats and for resources and power. So we have humans have a kind of instinct to identify who's in our in group and who's in our out group. Now that doesn't mean that we um, are bound to that. Culture can help us to broaden our horizons to include, um, groups to identify as human and as deserving of respect, peoples outside of these groups. But it's nevertheless a very powerful instinct and does have an important political and psychological impact. Now, what is the source of conflict in international relations? It's basically the fact that if you look at the 200 or so countries of the world, they don't really correspond in any neat way to the mapping of ethno-nationalist groups around the world. In other words, there are probably by one count about 700 major ethno-nationalist groups, and if one defines them more narrowly, one could multiply that even more. But let's go with 700. Well, if we have 200 countries, then obviously there are lots of groups that don't have their own state. There are lots of states whose territory includes multiple ethnic groups. There are ethnic groups that are spread, as the Kurds are, across different countries. So the fact that not every group has its own state, and that there are multiple groups contending within states or across boundaries, creates a potential for conflict that often takes the form of civil war and sometimes interstate war. So one could see that disjuncture between state boundaries and ethno-nationalist groupings as one of the fundamental sources of conflict. Threat assessments. One defines enemies as those groups who are able to pose a competition for political power, wealth, land, cultural dominance. And as we said, that's not necessarily another state. It could be other groups within your own territory. Famously, for instance, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which we talked about this as a source of World War I, included so many different linguistic groups, cultural groups, national identities under an empire that it became impossible to hold it together. What are the main predictions? Well, Amy Chua argues that tribalism tends to rise during periods of economic insecurity because the pie is getting smaller, and so each group is worried both about that they're going to compete harder for what pie is left, and they're going to worry about their share of the pie, how big a slice of what remains is there. So economic insecurity intensifies competition among groups for resources. She also identifies this idea of a market-dominant minority. And basically, this is a group that is ethnically a minority within the country. They are, less than half the population, but they have a dominant economic position. And this particularly becomes a source of conflict if the majority group has political power and then the minority has economic power. So, for instance, in many Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, Chinese ethnic group has a disproportionate economic power. They're the merchants, they're the business people in many of these countries predominantly, and they're much wealthier than the Malays or the other Indonesians, and yet they are not. They don't hold dominance at the political level, and so that can lead to pressures from the majority for the political elite, for the state, to redistribute resources out of the hands of the market dominant minority. So that can intensify ethnic conflict. Um, the Often the kinds of conflicts here are internal to states, but very often as well, external actors choose sides in these civil wars and intervene either directly with military force in some cases or indirectly with aid or political support. So, Syria, for instance, Iran, Russia, Turkey, the United States, Saudi Arabia, all have intervened in the civil war that has only recently sort of diminished after a number of years of quite bloody conflict. So that's an example of a civil war that draws in international intervention and becomes really an international conflict. So that's tribalism. I'll show you a couple of maps that give an idea of the sort of conditions that can give rise to tribalism and to conflict. This is the Caucasus region of bordering on Turkey and Russia. And you can see here, this is a linguistic map. Look at the variety of different languages that are spoken in this one fairly, small area covering Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is a very complex ethnic and cultural mix here. We can see some parts of Africa, particularly across just south of the Sahel Desert, has a great deal of ethno-linguistic diversity. You can't really tell from this map, but these little labels are different major tribal groups, and that diversity can, in some cases, has made it difficult for post-colonial governments. These boundaries were, in fact, determined by the former colonial powers, and they didn't correspond to any natural ethnic or tribal groupings, and therefore you have these territories run by post-colonial states that include lots of different groups that pre-colonial did not belong together, and now they're being kind of squeezed together and told to become Nigerians, even though many people's first identity is not Nigerian. Maybe it's with their particular tribe or locality, and so the ethnic, religious, language diversity makes it kind of hard to hold these states together in coherent fashion and to marshal a common identity. This is a map showing an idea proposed by the late Samuel Huntington, who was a famous political scientist. Huntington proposed in the late 90s, he said, after the end of the Cold War, we can expect a clash of civilizations. And he defined about 7 civilizations. In different writings, he varied a little bit on these definitions, but you had Western Christendom, you had the Islamic civilization, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Hindu, Buddhist, Sinic, meaning Chinese, Japan. Now, what's really kind of odd about this is that some of these are just geographic, right? Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa. There's no pretending that they have really a common culture or language. Um, Others are religious, Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu. Others are basically just a country like Japan. So it's, and then, Russia is also up there, kind of by itself, but he includes some other non-Russian states that have substantial Russian influence, Slavic civilizations, you would call them. So his argument was that countries would cluster together according to their civilization and support other countries within their civilization and come into conflict with countries in other civilizations. But at the same time, he also argued that the main fault line would be the West versus the rest. So he thought that Western countries had carried out 200 years of colonialism and political domination of the rest of the world, and now the rest of the world was rising economically and in population, and would sort of come together to try to balance the power of the West. This is taking the tribalist theory and basically, instead of taking actual groupings, it's clustering these huge civilizations together in ways that really don't make a whole lot of sense. For instance, if you look at what he calls the Islamic world, there's conflict between Islamic world and the West, perhaps, but there's far more conflict within the Islamic world, right? Between Sunni and Shia, or between secular and religious, or even just, plain old nationalist types of conflicts. Within sub-Saharan Africa, you look at a case like Rwanda, where you had Hutus and Tutsis fighting one another. By most standards, they were very close together culturally, and yet it didn't stop them from making sufficient distinction to come into conflict. So this was a popular theory for a while. I think it's not very well supported. Now, the third theory is Marxism, and this starts with the 19th century German philosopher Karl Marx, who basically developed a critique of capitalism and a theory of history, arguing that there was a natural progression of different types of economies, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, and then eventually to socialism or communism. And so Marx had a grand theory of history, and this theory can be applied in some ways to international relations. The actors are not states or tribes; they're classes. The capitalist world is divided into the owners of capital and those who work for wages, who work for those owners. And the relationship is seen as an exploitative one, that basically the profits are a way of taking surplus produced by workers and funneling it into the hands of the capitalists. So that the capitalists don't really provide any value of their own. They basically live off the fruits of the workers who work their factories. The motivations for classes, whether they're workers or capitalists, is economic gain. As I said, the structure is ruling capitalist class versus a working class. The threat is that to the capitalists is that workers will lose faith in capitalism and democracy and revolt. And this can take different forms. Some see today that both that populism, whether of the extreme right wing side, such as Donald Trump and some Boris Johnson or Orban in Hungary, or left wing, such as Bernie Sanders or others, that either way, that they both are in some sense a threat to capitalism. The predictions are that capitalism is prone to crisis because it's based upon an unsustainable relationship of exploitation. So it leads to growing inequality, a concentration of ownership of production, intensifying class conflict, and the main international factor will be a backlash against capitalist globalization. So we saw globalization begin to intensify, globalization being the growing interdependence across countries economically, that began to really intensify starting around 1980. And from a Marxist theoretical standpoint, it began to lead to a crisis of capitalism in 2008 with the financial crisis, and continues now. We're seeing another crisis of globalization that will undo the capitalist governments, will render apart the trade relationships and the international institutions that have supported the capitalist global system, and lead to some kind of shift toward socialism or communism. That's a Marxist theory. So we have five main theories. Two of them are relatively have stronger representation in the study of international relations, but the other three all have insights to offer, and we'll refer back to these as we study various topics throughout the rest of the semester. I'm sorry, I left out one. This, by the way, shows from a Marxist perspective, this makes sense. The inequality, income inequality in Anglo-Saxon countries declines in the first half of the 20th century, but then begins to rise around 1980 and has reached new extremes now that are leading to political conflict. This shows that in the 50s and 60s, there up to about mid-70s, that workers' wages grew in tandem with productivity, but since then, workers' productivity has continued to increase. That every year they produce more goods per hour, but their compensation has stagnated, meaning that really they're not the exploitation is the difference between the high productivity and the low compensation. The final theory, which I'm sorry, I almost skipped over, is constructivism. Now, I'll tell you from the start, constructivism is not easy to explain. It's not really a separate theory in itself. It's more of a different way of looking at any theory. And basically, constructivism means that all of social reality is constructed by humans. That it's not something that's natural. It's not something that's inevitable. It's something that we create, and that that is driven by ideas. So it's a theory that focuses on ideas more than material factors like money or like for Marxism, it's the means of production, factories, raw materials. For realism, it's tanks and guns. For liberals, it's trade and goods and services, material kind of factors that drive international politics. More similar to tribalism, which focuses on ideas about group identity. Constructivism is also an idea-driven theory. So it focuses on social groups that share a common identity. Nationalist groups would be an example of that. But they would argue that, classes are also, a social group that's driven by a common identity, but they would think about it in terms of ideas rather than material realities. One of the interesting insights that constructivism offers is in explaining behavior. Um, for for the other theories, really, especially I would say liberalism, Marxism, realism, they explain behavior by reference to a logic of consequences. Logic of consequences. What I mean by that is that people make decisions based upon what they think the expected consequences will be, right? So I have an end goal in mind, and I figure out what actions I can take to achieve that goal. And those consequences are, thought of in terms of self-interest. I try to bring about, I try to gain something. In realism, it's gain relative status compared to other states. And liberalism, it's gaining absolute wealth. And um, in Marxism, it's also economic gain, right? I want something. I look to figure out among the various options I could choose to actions I could take, which ones will be most likely to bring the gain that I seek. That's a logic of consequences. Another way of and by the way, that's rooted in rationality. It's a ends means ends kind of thinking, right? Um, but the other way that constructivists say that that's not how most of us behave. We don't actually carry out these kind of fine-grained calculations most of the time. In fact, if we were to try to live that way, it would produce it would be virtually impossible for us to carry out those kind of calculations. They're simply it would be too complex and impossible to manage our lives that way. Instead, what we do is we find ourselves in certain roles, either roles that have been imposed upon us or roles that we have sought out and chosen. And those roles are things like we're a parent, we're a child, we're a brother or a sister, we're a teacher or we're a student, right? We're a president or we're a senator, right? We have certain roles. We're an American, we're Chinese. And each of those roles carries with them a set of social expectations, right? How one behaves within that role. Now, of course, we all have multiple roles. I'm a teacher. I'm a scholar. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a son. I'm a brother. Um, I'm an American. I have many different roles. I'm male. I'm white, etc. And with each of those roles, society develops a certain set of expectations about how someone behaves with respect to their role. And most of the time, the question we ask ourselves is not how do I calculate what actions will achieve a goal. Instead, it's what actions conform most closely to the expectations others have for me playing this role, right? So you join a new job, right? There's certain expectations for an accountant, right? What an accountant does with their day, um, what products they produce, um, even how they dress when they go to the office, right? There's certain expectations, and um, if you violate those expectations, then you experience social friction. There's some kind of pushback. There's some kind of resistance. You may be socially judged or shamed, or others will choose not to interact with you, or you lose your job, or you become estranged from your family, right? If you don't meet those expectations, there are consequences. So, in that sense, society has certain sanctions that try to push people back into those roles and to play the expected, um, uh, to act in certain ways. So this is called a logic of appropriateness. Basically, most of us, most of the time, try to figure out what is the appropriate behavior for our role. And this is the basic idea of constructivism, that we all play roles that are wrapped up with certain identities, and that we therefore our society establishes certain expectations. Now those can change. Expectations, cultural norms evolve and change over time. They're not static, but at any given point in time, they are very powerful, and they can play a big role in our lives. And so they also play a role in politics, and they play a role in international relations. There's a certain set of expectations of what a diplomat does and says and how they behave, and certain norms of diplomacy. And if you act outside of those norms, then you may be less effective, or you may be shamed or excluded. So the structure is a set of norms or expectations. That the threats are ideas that undermine previously accepted norms, roles, or identities. That's considered threatening. The main predictions are that ideas take precedence over material factors. So, for instance, realists say you look at capabilities rather than intentions, right? Constructivism would flip that around, because they would say North Korea has nuclear weapons. So does Great Britain. Why the capabilities may be very similar. In both cases, those weapons could destroy New York. And yet, the United States treats North Korea's nuclear weapons as a threat and goes to great lengths to try to pressure North Korea to give up those weapons. Whereas in the case of Great Britain, we treat those weapons as non-threatening, and in fact as strengthening our own security in some sense, since Great Britain is treated as an ally. So the same capabilities, very different. We treat them very differently, because we've made a prior determination on what constitutes a friend from a foe. The identity that North Korea and Great Britain play with respect to the United States are very different. Even money, that physical piece of paper, it has no inherent value. It's just a piece of paper. But we all decide to place a value on it and to accept it in exchange for goods and services that gives it socially constructed value. So we define friend and foe according to national identities and how similar and compatible they are, rather than material capabilities. And so consequences of anarchy are not written in stone. It really depends on how states construct their responses to international anarchy. So now we're finally done with, I think we're done with our theories. So that gives you some basic conceptual tools, a toolkit that we can use to look at both historically and currently at events in international relations and try to make sense of them. And remember, these theories are meant to simplify a complex reality for us, and so hopefully you'll find these helpful. Thanks.